Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Lessons in Education from the Pandemic, Navigating an Equitable Recovery, the final session of the day and of Unity Weekend. My name is Glenda Aldana Madrid. I'm a member of the Harvard College Class of 2007 and the Vice President of Reunion for the Harvard Latino Alumni Alliance. As I'm based in Seattle, Washington, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past, present, and future. I'd like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Additionally, I'd like to recognize that Harvard sits on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts tribe. I extend my respect to the Massachusetts elders, past, present, and emerging, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the first peoples of Massachusetts. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay profound respect to the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, their elders and their youth, with whom Harvard has ties and declared obligations dating back to the university's first 2 decades. The Harvard Charter of 1650 committed our institution to the education of English and Indian youth of this country. Our acknowledgement serves as a necessary step away from the erasure of these Indigenous histories of perseverance, water and land stewardship, innovation, and allyship. Now, a few housekeeping notes before we proceed. Closed captioning is available by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. We're using Zoom webinar for today's panel, so while the chat is open for you to engage with each other, please use the Q&A feature to submit questions to the panel. And now, onto today's conversation. Our moderator for our discussion on education is Angela N. Romans. Angela is the founding executive director of Innovation for Equity, a network of Black education leaders, where she focuses on supporting Black and Brown leaders and their organizations. She has more than 25 years of experience serving as a classroom teacher, academic advisor, college admissions officer, government official, education intermediary, and organizational and leadership consultant in nonprofit and public sector organizations. She holds a degree in biomedical engineering from the college and a master's in education and secondary math teaching and curriculum with an emphasis on urban education from the Graduate School of Education. You can read more about Angela in her bio, which is being shared via the chat. Now it is my pleasure to hand things off to Angela. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Glenda. Can you hear me? All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you to everyone who is here on this amazing Saturday. At least it's an amazing weather Saturday here in DC to talk about education, which is of course near and dear to my heart. And we have a wonderful panel of folks who are here to talk about their experiences. I just want to let folks know a couple of framing things as we get started on the panel. The first is this is the education panel, but education can go from cradle to career, or actually from the womb to the tomb, as some of us say. But today we're really going to be focusing on K-12 education. So that's the first framing piece. And then the second is that our panelists, this panel and our panelists are really going to focus on folks who are on the front lines in education, folks who are directly student and teacher and school facing and have been so throughout this pandemic, before and during and this pandemic. We want to do that because those are perspectives and experiences that too often get marginalized when we talk about when we have conversations about education. And the organizers, and I thank them for this, the organizers of this panel really wanted to focus on folks who are on the front lines, who are directly touching our students and teachers and schools. So that's the framing. And next, I am going to start inviting our panelists to come forward and introduce them. So our first panelist, just in alphabetical order by first name, is Kitt Hirasaki. And Kitt has worked as a product designer in the edtech industry for the past 9 years at Khan Academy, Coursera, and now a new startup called ByteLearn AI. ByteLearn AI. He was the lead designer for the free official SAT practice on Khan Academy, which was used by the majority of students, is used by the majority of students who practice for the SAT. Welcome, Kitt.
Thanks so much, Angela.
Yeah, thanks for being here. All right. Well, second on our panel, we have Marisol Pineda Conde, who is AB class of '08, and I didn't say Kitt is AB 96. Marisol has had the honor of serving as a former teacher and most recently as a high school principal in the Los Angeles area for the past 13 years. She currently serves as the Director of Operations and Development at The Teaching Well. Hello, Marisol.
Angela.
All right, and then next we have Melanie Shea, who is EdM class of 20, a brand spanking new master's student, a master's graduate who is a Mashpee Wampanoag. She was born and raised in Dorchester, which is where I taught, and graduated from the Harvard Grad School of Education Teacher Education Program, as I said, in 2020. She currently teaches history and civics at Madison Park Technical Vocational High School in Boston. Hi, Melanie. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Susan Yao, who is AB 09. And Susan has been a humanities teacher and administrator in independent schools, most recently the middle school head at Friends Academy in Massachusetts. And this year, she is building a progressive Buddhist school called Laughing Rivers. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, everyone.
All right. Well, let's get started by asking everyone one of my favorite questions, which is, why do you do what you do? Or sort of, how did you get here? So the question is really, when did you first consider focusing on education in your career? And maybe talk a little bit about how Harvard influenced that or didn't in your life and your decision. So how did you get started in education, and then what keeps you going in education given where we are right now? And anyone can start. Or why don't I start, one of you? Why don't you jump in?
I'm the oldest, so I'll start because I'm ancient. So thank you again, Angela. I got started actually when I was a Harvard undergrad. I was involved with the City Step program, and that was one of the first times when I was really involved working with kids. And I studied engineering and CS, and when I was interviewing for jobs at a school, or my senior year, I interviewed at this video game company, and halfway through the day, I realized I actually don't want to make like football video games. I kind of just didn't care. And I asked them, do you have any like educational titles or anything? And they were like, no, like we don't do that. And so I came back and I connected with some people back at Harvard and got sparked onto this idea of doing something really cool with education and software. But I don't know, this was back in the 90s. CD-ROMs were about the highest ed tech software there was then. And it just really wasn't the time. And so I pursued sort of a different path. I worked in entertainment. I worked at Pixar and Disney for a number of years. And then about, a little over 10 years ago, I heard about sort of rumblings of this thing called Khan Academy. And I realized that this dream I had sort of had for a long time was actually becoming a thing of education and technology really coming together. And so I made a pivot and started working there, and have been working there since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what keeps you going? What keeps you in it right now?
Yeah, in some ways, the original dream for me came from part of the dream came from reading a book called The Diamond Age, which is a science fiction novel in which this artificially intelligent Victorian storybook is created for a child, in which they become a character in the book. And it teaches them kind of everything they need to learn, whatever it may be, whatever their circumstances. And so I always had this dream, like it would be amazing to be able to help create this thing. And when I first went to Khan Academy, that was actually something Sal Khan had also been, he's kind of my contemporary into the age. And that was also a book he had read, and like, oh man, I want to make this thing. Actually, the current company I'm working at, we are specifically starting with artificial intelligence and machine learning as like the foundation of a lot of what we're doing. So I still have this dream of like 25 years ago, and I keep getting a little bit closer to maybe getting there. So I'm excited for sort of some of the new technology and opportunities that are coming up.
Excellent, thank you. Well, maybe we'll keep talking about that dream as we go throughout the panel. Let's go to Marisol, who is next on the screen on my computer.
Thanks, Angela. So I think my why really goes back to my experience. I grew up in Los Angeles as an undocumented immigrant who saw school as a means towards realizing the American dream as a means of social mobility. And so education was really formative for me in creating opportunity. And it was actually after my freshman year at Harvard that I had the opportunity to have an internship at the mayoral office in Los Angeles. And there was an awakening that happened that summer, because I had, up until that point, thought I had gone to a really good high school, or at least perceived my high school to be a really strong high school. And during that summer, I was a research analyst, and part of my job was crunching numbers to figure out what graduation projections were for high schools in the city of Los Angeles. And I realized that my high school, while it had a really awesome program, was only graduating about 40% of students. And it was in that moment that I had a quantifiable way to understand the experience that I had. And I began to reflect and understand that, yes, I saw students missing. As I became a sophomore, a junior, and a senior in high school, students were disappearing from the hallways of my school. And I didn't really have the tools or the wherewithal or the awareness at that time to really be able to comprehend what I was experiencing. And it was that summer where I finally had a really almost like an awakening, and began to realize how deeply impacted my community was by the push out, how deeply impacted my community was by students dropping out of high school. And so really lit a fire for me. After that, I came back to Harvard and changed my career path and decided to really focus on education. And so ever since, the fire has continued to burn and continues to burn today, but it really was the opportunity to make sense of my experience and to have the access to the data to really highlight the inequities and the challenges that I had experienced, and realizing that I had an opportunity to do something about it, that I could come back to my community and serve in the classrooms and be able to have a direct impact on shifting that story for some students in the city. So I continue to strive towards doing that every day.
Excellent. And I know your students benefit from it, that awakening, that feels actually so familiar. So let's go next to Melanie.
Thanks, Angela. I really wish that I had as like compelling and beautiful a journey as I'm hearing from Kitt and Marisol, but I'm really, it would make for a much better story. But for me, really, it was just sort of as I was reflecting on my career, I was thinking about how every time I found myself moving back into opportunities to work closer with students again, from the moment I started working at the age of 15. And so a few years ago, I decided to make the decision to take the plunge and face my fears. I was terrified, but face my fears and enroll in the Harvard Ed teacher education program under the tutelage of Dr. Christina Villarreal. And it has been the hardest thing and the greatest thing, becoming a teacher over these last couple of years, with the pandemic adding a little extra bit of spice to what already is quite an interesting journey. So, but yes, and so now, being born and raised in Dorchester and working, a BPS kid myself, working in BPS now, is something that I didn't know would be such an important thing for me, but it really has been.
Yeah, excellent, Melanie. And your story is definitely inspiring. Let's go last but not least to Susan.
So my why is a lot about, trying to shape a different future. I think our actions as adults certainly have a huge impact on what the future will look like, but it really is so beautiful and necessary to raise a different generation of kids who are going to have to tackle the problems that we have left them. And so for me, education is about that potential to change the future world. And at Harvard, I thought I wanted to go into education policy because of that interest. And I did internships at the policy level. And when I worked on my thesis, I really didn't want to move on from the field work to the writing. I really just wanted to stay in the classroom. I was interviewing students and teachers, and that was really where I felt like I wanted to be full time. And so what keeps me going is just seeing how many important changes are happening in education. And I know we'll talk about some of them today. And just seeing things improving, seeing really new ideas for education, seeing more centering of the needs of students of color, more racial literacy among educators. That gives me a lot of hope.
All right, we're going to talk about that hope in a minute, Susan. Let's, though, first start in a place where a lot of you talked about your why, right? That you saw disparities in your experiences growing up, in your communities and other communities that you were serving, and that motivated you to get into education. So let's touch on that a little bit. And as we know, this pandemic, or the COVID-19 pandemic, has exacerbated has really highlighted and exacerbated many of the inequities that we see in society, right? And all the ways. So just wanted to hear directly from you, what ways you've seen those disparities showing up in your work in education over the past couple of years. And Melanie, you look like you want to jump in.
So of course, please take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt as a baby teacher with relatively very few years of experience directly in the classroom, especially compared to the folks here. But yeah, as you're saying, these gaps didn't come from the pandemic. They did not just suddenly appear. They're really just revealing and exacerbating what those problems were already. And one of the biggest things that I've seen so far is this disconnect between the narrative that I'm hearing it on the news and what I'm actually seeing in my classroom of, for example, while a lot of us were remote, this idea of, despondent children at home, sort of bored with what was happening, not having enough stimulation, whereas the issue that a lot of my students were having was that, in fact, they were overstimulated and dealing with even more than they ever had before, whether it was increasing the number of shifts that they had to take in order to help support the family, increasing their role as caregivers, either for elderly grandparents or especially for younger siblings, and helping them with their schooling, along with the myriad other issues we know that teenagers are dealing with today, and the health disparities that come with poverty in a capitalist system, that come with being in communities of color in a deeply divided and segregated city like Boston. And so I think hearing these things that were these issues that were so incredibly disconnected to the issues that I was seeing in front of me, and nowhere close to trying to address those, I think was something that really stood out to me, and continues to stand out to me since we are clearly not out of this pandemic yet.
Yeah, that disconnect between what you are seeing and what we're hearing about, and sort of the noise in the reporting about education, that I've heard a lot. What about you, Marisol, on the left coast over there?
Yes, I think very similar to what Melanie shared. Students and families really, specifically in Los Angeles, were facing tremendous challenges, but we're also not able to access the best practices that we were sharing. And so as a school, we were doing our best to educate our community as best as possible, and really be able to offer some suggestions on how to navigate this pandemic as best as we could. And we realized really quickly that what we were saying was just not realistic. We were asking folks to stay home. That was not realistic. The vast majority of our families were families where many folks were essential workers, and staying home was not an option, which then created a cascading effect. Then students had to step in and become caretakers of the younger children. We were saying to folks, come to class, get online, and realizing that that was not accessible to the students and families that we were serving, even when we were providing hotspots, because in Los Angeles, we just didn't have the infrastructure in these highly dense apartment buildings to be able to connect and have the connectivity necessary to access. And so what we found is that as much as our families were wanting, attentive, and had a commitment to being able to navigate in the best way that we had, there was still a very glaring gap between what was accessible to them and our ability to meet that gap. And it really was just exacerbated by COVID-19, by the pandemic, when we were asking folks to quarantine once somebody in their household was positive. Well, how do you quarantine when you have a multifamily unit in a 1-bedroom apartment? It's just not feasible. And so as much as we had really positive intentions, I think we were really confronting in our face the true challenges that many folks live day to day, and we're having to think about more creative solutions and different ways to navigate. It was very evident that we were not in the same boat.
Right. Thank you, Marisol. And what are you seeing in the ed tech space, Kitt? Marisol talked about the disparities in access to just the bandwidth to get online. What are you experiencing in your work with schools and teachers and students?
Yeah, definitely. 2020 was quite an exciting year for educational technology. I mean, basically, yeah. Basically, the industry just sort of took off just looking from an industry perspective, because suddenly everyone had to be using some kind of online system, be it Google Classroom or things like Khan Academy or all manner of resources, right? And so from an ed tech perspective, just from an industry perspective, like it was a real watershed year in terms of like, oh, wow, there's opportunities we really there's a lot of need out there. What can we do to really fill that need? But from the perspective of looking at this is more like a personal perspective of me, but I was a very early lockdown proponent. As soon as coronavirus was on my radar, I was like, no, we're not leaving the house. And I sit in a place of privilege. I live sort of in a suburb up in Northern California, and I was really thinking, okay, I just gotta keep my family safe. I'm going to try to be as careful as possible. I'm going to try to get as educated as I can around coronavirus. And certainly there've been many all kinds of loss, both of life as well as of livelihoods and things that have come as a result of the lockdown efforts. But the thing that if there's it's not a regret, it's something I had control over, but just recognizing that the pandemic schooling that we had to do, the lockdowns, the year of basically remote learning has, by this McKinsey report, which I'll probably refer to multiple times in this discussion, measured that for kids like grades 1 through 6 over that span lost or failed to learn about 5 months of math learning and about 4 months of reading development. And that's not remotely trivial to make up. So there's lots of things, there's ways our government can backfill in terms of money to sort of support people, but it's really hard when you get behind in school to make a comeback or to overcome those kind of deficits. Also, lots of people dropping out of high school during the pandemic because it was just disconnected. So we have we have a generation of 12 years of kids, right, who are all suffering from these kinds of deficits. And they're going to be moving forward into the workforce, they're moving forward in their lives. And it's a whole generation that's basically been penalized in terms of probably their lifetime opportunities. And this is there's definitely a lot of money at the federal level being put into trying to help schools or to do things, but I don't see the level of public awareness or concern about this or recognition. I think even from a parent perspective, parents don't really understand how big the gaps are or how much was not learned. Part of this is effectively grade inflation. You don't want to dock everyone's grades in the whole year because they didn't learn 4 months of stuff. And so this is what parents are using to try to know what's going on. But instead you sort of get this, oh yeah, we're kind of papering over the problem here because we don't want to hurt kids later on because it was sort of a bad year. So there's just like this awareness, I think, I feel is just missing. But teachers are seeing it. I mean, I'm talking to teachers as they're going to school and they're like, oh my God, like we're going back over last year's stuff and kids just didn't really learn it. And I think there's, even the work that I'm doing, working on ways to help kids learn math. Like, I think there's going to be huge need, and I don't think it's going to be short term. I think it's going to last for a long time just to get out of this.
Yeah. Well, there is clearly so much work to do. I mean, we could talk for another 3 hours about just all the disparities and what you are seeing in your experiences. And I want to maybe shift to Susan's comment about hope and what keeps you going. So Susan, do you want to talk a little bit about any bright spots that you're seeing? Arundhati Roy talked about the pandemic being a portal, and there's certainly opportunities in any crisis potentially. So what are the bright spots that you're seeing in your experience in your school and in the school you're starting? And then are there opportunities where you're like, this is not a bright spot yet, but I see the glimmer for opportunities for innovation. And I don't mean innovation just in the ed tech space, which is where we talk about it a lot, but like innovations in terms of practice or policies or programs or approaches to education. So bright spots and then the like glimmers of opportunity.
Sure. So I think people who work in schools know that they change very slowly. Really can take years to try and change policy within a school. And what the pandemic forced us to do and showed us was possible was just enormous structural change in a very short amount of time. Almost overnight, schools are transitioning to online learning and learning Zoom. And we showed ourselves that we can change quickly and we can change for the sake of our students. And so there were some changes we made that were just more mission aligned, that we're going more towards mastery learning and, rethinking homework policies and rethinking things we should have been rethinking anyways. One of the changes we made at Friends Academy was moving everybody outdoors. And we were a school that, claims to support the outdoors, but we weren't using this campus that we had. And we, made some DIY furniture outside, and our classes were outdoors for most of the fall until November. And so that's something that we really forced ourselves to do. And I hope we can keep pieces of that. And so I think, we saw examples of that in schools.
Yeah, definitely more outside time it could be a good bright spot. Other bright spots that folks are seeing or opportunities for changes. Marisol, what about you? Over in LA, someone asked in the chat, where do we all reside? So I'm in DC. And Marisol is in Los Angeles. So what about over in Los Angeles? What are you seeing?
Hey, one of the bright spots that comes to mind is sort of building on what Susan shared with regards to there are certain features of education that are static. And one of those features is the school day and the schedule. That's pretty standard across the board. Students are in school for X amount of hours. And what school closure, distance learning, and the pandemic really did was freed up the schedule to not be as static. And so what we found was that we were able to think more creatively about how we were embedding intervention for students, how we were able to more effectively create small group differentiation in ways that if we had all been in the building with the same schedule and structure that we're so accustomed to would not have been possible. And so for me, it just really pushed my thinking in realizing that we can be creative and we can infuse opportunity for us to think outside of the box in ways that previously just would not have been feasible given the constraints of that time and the constraints of the building. And so I hope that that's something that we can hold on to, is really think creatively about how do we meet the needs of all of our students in a creative fashion and are not bogged down by some of the the structures and the systems that we're so accustomed to.
Thank you. Well, yeah, what about you, Kitt?
Yeah, something Susan said, I think, is just in terms of some of the things that you mentioned, probably should have been doing already that it helped accelerate for us. I'm specifically specifically thinking also about things like mastery-based learning, as well as like proficiency-based grading. So some of these, some are definitely familiar with what this means, but in traditional sort of learning, you would cover some topic. You do it for 2 weeks and you have a test, you get a grade on the test, and then you like go on to the next topic. And you don't necessarily come back to that original topic, and it's sort of like, okay, you got an 85, like, let's move on. With mastery-based learning, what you're doing is it's not about what was that snapshot in time when did you know this material, like at the end of the time when the teacher was finished teaching it to you. With mastery-based learning, students are able to not only sort of like move a little bit more at their own pace, but be able to come back and sort of say, it's not about at that moment did I have it, but what am I learning over this whole time period that I'm of the whole semester or the whole year? You have this opportunity. So it's not just these time slices. And if you don't get it, then like, sorry, you lost or you got a bad grade. You have these opportunities to continue growing. And I think this pairs actually well with proficiency-based grading. We don't need to get into this conversation, but there's whole questions around sort of like standardized testing, or like, what is the purpose of that? Or what are the challenges that come with it? But one of the benefits of things like standardized tests or standards is that you can hold people accountable, both students and teachers, to achieving and sort of like measuring things accurately to understand really where kids are learning. And so with proficiency-based grading, it's less about sort of arbitrary things, and it's more about, are you actually demonstrating the skills that you're supposed to be learning? It's really looking at the results as opposed to some concoction of things we sort of put together to come up with some grade. It's like, okay, we're actually assessing these skills very directly, so we really understand what you're doing. So this kind of, to me, like the more we are sort of transparent and clear, and everyone is using the same language, and it's focused on these positive learning results, like that's what we're focusing on, that's gonna be good for everyone, I hope. Or at least it keeps us all focused on the right goal, or one of the most important goals, which is actually the learning that's going on.
Yeah, here for the learning goals and for accountability for students and teachers, and also the broader system, right, that we're all in as a bright spot. Melanie, anything to add in terms of bright spots or opportunities that you're seeing for innovation?
Yeah, I echo what our other panelists have said, in that I think it can feel daunting or impossible to change the education system, but we saw that it's not impossible, and in fact that it is quite necessary. I think it also exposed to the extent to which how that inflexibility can harm students when these changes come up. The difference of the pandemic, I think we sort of panic and freak out about the pandemic because there were no excellent choices. There and still not. There are still no perfect choices. There are still no great choices for education in the pandemic. Massachusetts has banned virtual schools, except in very specific cases, and parents are really struggling with that. And we're still, again, in the middle of a pandemic, and we're still trying to figure out what is that balance between making sure in-person schooling is great, but also making sure that families can feel safe and do what they need to do to keep themselves safe. But I think what really got a lot of people's skin in the game was that, as opposed to before the pandemic, education was not working for many students of color, many low-income students, many disabled students, et cetera. But that was gaps. That was expected, and therefore not as pressing or as urgent. During the pandemic, education was tough for everyone, even those kids who have learned the game and who know how to do our education system. And so all of a sudden, You know, those kids in Lexington, those kids in private schools, and you know, they were also struggling with that learning progress. And so it kind of got everybody's attention and their skin in the game. And I think you were seeing this unprecedented focus on what is the best approach to teaching and learning that has galvanized people in a way that I really haven't seen since in a long time. So I think that's a really great opportunity for us to really rethink what does education look like that works for everyone, and not just what does it look like to get back to normal, because normal was never working for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2 snaps to that, Melanie. And Susan, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, to build off of that, the market has really opened up, especially for communities that were not being served by traditional schools, because pretty much every family in America was forced to rethink school. Do I need school? Why do I need school? Is this school really serving my child? And there have been articles about families of color choosing to homeschool because they realized they could do it, and they realized that that might be a better option. And you see a wave of new schools starting, which is really exciting. And I've seen a number popping up opened by people of color. And I think the pandemic really created some opportunities, because families who might have defaulted to the school that they're in are now more open to different structures, and those new structures are becoming available. You know, I'm in a founders group with other people of color who are all starting schools this year, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, super, super exciting to see that, and to see more, more schools being founded, sort of different structures, a lot that is being led by people of color, knowing the gaps in leadership by BIPOC folks in education. And so, that is in the context of this uprising or racial reckoning, or all the words, none of which I love, but this sort of national movement recognition around the pandemic of centuries old racial and other oppression, right? So given that, one of the things that we are hearing a lot about, I think to Melanie's point about this disconnect between what's being experienced and what's being talked about, is this whole notion of critical race theory. And I know a couple of the other panelists have talked about that throughout this weekend. So, there's some great resources that I think our folks from HIA can put in the chat for folks who are interested in knowing more about critical race theory, actual critical race theory. But I think for our purposes, people have been talking about, how do we make sure that our young people know about the history of racial and other oppression in this country, for schools to have the opportunity to impart, or to facilitate, or to just hold space for conversations about social justice and equity in this country. So what are you seeing, or what are you hoping that will come out of this conversation around greater social justice and equity, and making sure that young people have the right context, the right knowledge for being citizens, informed citizens, anti-racist, and just citizens in this country? And what's the role of schools and teachers in that, as you see? Susan, you want to start?
Well, I was trying to think of an optimistic answer, but I think we've had a lot of anti-racist conversations in schools, and I want to believe that this time is different and we'll see more lasting change this time, but I just worry it's going to be a sort of, 1950s backlash. We're seeing this in independent schools right now, of white parents being coached on how to talk to the school to combat anti-racist work, and how to use a lot of that language to say, well, I feel marginalized as a conservative family. My white children, are marginalized and silenced, and they're using a lot of that language to slow down the work. And so, I I would like to be optimistic, and I think backlash is always there, and I'm not sure yet what this will look like in a year. And I think people will start to say, well, I'm tired because of COVID, so let's slow down the work again, which as educators, I think we've seen many times. But someone else can jump in with a more optimistic view.
Appreciate the real talk, Susan. I mean, let's keep it real on this panel. Other folks, what are you seeing? Optimistic or not so optimistic? What about you, Melanie? What's happening over in Dorchester or in Madison Park?
Well, I think one thing that I'm really grateful for is that BPS and the BTU have really been pushing for a very thoughtful approach for incorporating these kind of conversations into the curriculum, with the piloting of the ethnic studies course that is happening in BPS, and that expansion, and the many conversations that have happened around how are we making our students' voices centered in the classroom. And one thing that I'm personally trying to do better is also be transparent about the choices I'm making in my pedagogy and in my materials with my students. Or if there's a certain rule that maybe I don't agree with, or being very saying hey, let's talk about this. This is what has to happen in the classroom because this is the rule. And I think, that's still very much you're still adhering to the rule. You're still doing what needs to be done. But you're also inviting your students along on this conversation with you to say, why do these things happen? What are these structures? Which is also in itself, a very important conversation to have. I don't want to stress any of our folks moderating the Zoom out, but there's a book by Dr. Goldie Mohammed that I'm actually reading at the moment called Cultivating Genius, where Dr. Mohammed talks about criticality. And I think there are so many ways that we can sort of proceed until apprehended with these kind of things, and so many ways that actually our students are already leading the way, and really it's our job to take our cue from them and really build in their power.
Yeah, the youth are leading us in this. So #resistance around this so-called moral panic. Actually, I don't know if folks from HAA want to put in the chat, there's a great podcast from Code Switch about the history of so-called moral panics in this country, and around all kinds of things like busing in the 70s, et cetera, and putting this whole kerfuffle about critical race theory in that larger historical context. So check it out if you want to listen to a great podcast. So we're seeing students leading in this space, young people leading in this space. Anything else that folks are thinking about in terms of how to make sure that how to empower or hold space for teaching about justice and equity in the classroom?
One thing that's coming to mind for me is just really centering, what are the skills that we're focusing on for our young folks? And Melanie, you sort of hinted at this, there will be instances where we don't agree, or I may not agree, or you may not agree. And how are we really centering dialogue as a means towards bringing in conversation, as opposed to saying no, we're not doing this, we're not discussing this, we're not talking about this, but really being able to empower our students to ask questions, and empowering our students to evaluate and make sense of and use their tools of dialogue and research to build their own opinions. I do think that particularly for me, my experience has been different being in Los Angeles and in California in particular, where there is a movement towards incorporating ethnic studies. We've had, at least at the school that I led, ethnic studies was a course that almost every single student took. It's part of our A through G requirements. And there is a move in California to make ethnic studies part of a graduation requirement for high school. And so I do think there's a lot more momentum in this state in particular, and there's really a sense that as was hinted earlier, our current educational system is not reflective of the folks that are being served. And there is a need for us to bring more people to the table and to really center dialogue, inclusivity, anti-racist, and even abolitionist thinking as we're imagining new schools and a new way of learning. And so I really invite folks to really consider the work of Dr. Bettina Love, and We Want to Do More Than Survive, a text that really pushes our thinking around what it means to educate, and what it means to be an educator, and sort of the relationship of that space that we hold that's so sacred, and how we might be able to dream something different.
Yeah, that dreaming something different is so critical, both in this time and, has always been, and especially in this time. And, thinking about who's in the classroom to have those dreams, communicate those dreams, share those dreams with our young people is an important question as well. So let's talk about that. What are we seeing in terms of the teacher force right now in education? Where are we seeing change? Where are there opportunities? What's not good? And where are there some either bright spots or opportunities for change around the teaching force that is working to support our young people?
I actually have another question, maybe someone else can answer on top, which is, I had read some things that were hypothesizing that because of the pandemic, there'd be a large number of teacher retirements or people leaving the industry. But I haven't necessarily seen follow-up information that suggests that has been a big issue or what that means. So I'm actually curious myself around sort of what has that look like in practice.
Yeah, what are folks seeing? Susan, as a school leader, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see a national teacher shortage, and I think we have always seen a shortage, especially in areas like math, science, special education, a need for more teachers. And I thought it would happen more last year, but I think a lot of teachers were willing to, stick with their school and their students, and then see what these safety measures were, and more have left in the past year. And I haven't seen numbers on it, but you can see, for example, schools that don't normally have attrition of teachers are just posting dozens of job openings, and hiring much later in the year than they normally would, and still having openings in the middle of the year. And so teachers are tired. I have so much respect for healthcare workers who knew what they were getting into, that if there's a pandemic, my life may be at risk, and I will continue to do my job because I'm committed to supporting the folks in the hospital or wherever I work. And I think educators weren't necessarily prepared for that, and weren't necessarily in facilities that were prepared to keep them physically safe. And so there were early retirements. There were folks with health issues or family members with pre-existing conditions. I knew a teacher who lost 4 family members during the pandemic. And so how can you ask them to go back in person to school and risk exposure? So for many reasons, teachers are leaving the teaching force, and it's so hard to join the teaching force. I know Massachusetts passed some emergency measures to make it easier, but getting a year master's degree student teaching, there's going to be quite a delay before we can get more people into the teaching force, and we really need to rethink what our requirements are. And so in the meantime, I think schools might be short-staffed in different ways. People might be teaching more than they usually do, or teaching outside of their typical assignments. I think schools are finding a way, but I do see signs of a shortage for sure. And I worry about the teachers who are still in the force.
Yeah. Well, I mean, mental health of teachers is a huge issue that we've heard about, and many of you, I'm sure, have experienced. So are there, you know, want to continue the conversation about what you're seeing in the teaching force, and also bring up the subject of mental health, and, you know, what are you seeing where schools are supporting, or, well, let's talk about the positives, maybe the bright spots, or maybe the gaps in terms of supporting teachers' mental health, students' mental health, maybe even parents' mental health, because this is all about our ecosystem, right? So, just you know, keeping the conversation going about the teacher force, but also introducing, you know, what you're saying about mental health and support for educators and students as well. And Marisol, you looked like you were going to say something.
Yes. So I think the question around like all of these different subgroups that we talked, students, the teachers, families, there's a need for us to recognize that all of us have experienced the pandemic, and with that, there has been a tremendous amount of